next few minutes is give you a sense of what we've learned about the neural systems, the brain systems in reading and dyslexia. And we've learned a great deal over the last 2 decades, primarily because of the emergence of a wonderful technology called functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI. I'll tell you a little bit about this as we go along. But I'll give you the take-home message first, and that is what the brain imaging has taught us about dyslexia. First, that there is a neural signature for dyslexia, and that signature is an inefficient functioning of those neural systems for skilled or fluent reading. And we think that the most important thing about this is that it's made visible what previously was a hidden disability. It just reinforces and I think provides visual evidence that dyslexia is real. I have a caveat, though, and that is while brain imaging has been extremely robust and reliable, and I'll show you scientists all over the world pretty much find the same results regardless of the language spoken, brain imaging will work in groups of people, but it won't work in individual cases. So typically we can see differences in groups of 20 or 30 or sometimes 70 or sometimes 100 dyslexic people compared to 100 typical readers. But if I were to try to make a diagnosis of dyslexia using brain imaging on a single case, it just wouldn't work. It's too much variability. So it's not like, if you think you have diabetes, someone will get a blood glucose, but this is not the case at all. People are working on trying to do this. But as Sally will tell you in a few minutes, you really do not need brain imaging to diagnose dyslexia. Functional magnetic resonance imaging has really been developed from the late 1980s through the current time, and most of you are familiar with an MRI from either been imaged for a headache or a knee injury. And here is Casey, one of the participants in our study, and Casey's in an imager, and she's looking up through a prism at tasks that we're presenting, and she has a button box in her hand. And what our typical tasks are that Casey is looking at is we ask people to tell us whether these nonsense words rhyme, and we like to use nonsense words because people can't have memorized them. So the only way that you would really know that leet and jeet rhyme and that mobe and habe don't rhyme is to sort of understand the principles of phonology. And it's a very user-friendly technology. Here's Casey, none the worse for wear. And there's no radiation, which is very good, and there's no injections, which is also good. And so you can use brain imaging, functional MRI, to study children on several occasions, for example. What we've learned is that there are differences in the 3 important neural systems for reading, that they're all localized in the left side of the brain. And here's a figure from Sally's book. We're looking at the left side of the brain. Here is the frontal lobes, they're in green. Remember, there's one on the left side, there's also one on the right side. Behind the frontal lobes are the parietal lobes, and beneath the frontal and the parietal lobes are the temporal lobes, and then behind them all are the occipital lobe. And there are 3 important systems for reading, one in the front of the brain here, and 2 in the back of the brain, one about here and one about here. And we've learned from studies over the years that these are really critical in differentiating dyslexic from typical readers. So here is a side view of the brain, and we see differences between a group of 70 dyslexic readers compared to 70 typical readers. Typical readers are activating these regions, these 3 regions in the left side of the brain. I've shown them here as well. 1 in the front of the brain and 2 in the back of the brain. And this is a paper that summarizes data from many, many papers on dyslexia, and you see the same kinds of phenomenon. differences in the front of the brain and 2 in the back of the brain. So it's very consistent from scientists around the world. Here is another way of representing that neural signature. If we are looking at the left side of the brain, we see typical readers are activating systems in the back of the brain and system in the front of the brain as well. In typical readers, we see that there's inefficient functioning in dyslexic readers of those systems in the back of the brain, perhaps overactivation in the front of the brain. And this is and this is found all over the world. This is a paper by a colleague of ours who is a neurologist who works in Milan, Italy, and he studied groups of children in England and in France and in Italy. They compared dyslexic college students in each of those countries to their typical reading peers. And what we see is, this is the front of the brain, this is the back of the brain. Regardless of the language spoken, the differences were in these systems in the back of the brain. The same findings have been reported in dyslexic readers in Germany and also in Chinese dyslexic readers. We've also learned, excuse me, that there is excuse me, that one of these systems is really important for skilled or fluent reading, and it's this system shown in yellow in the cartoon, and it's the cutaway view. It's this system in the back of the brain. And here in our actual data, as the reading skill increases, so if we measure reading skill in a typical reading test, the better the reader, the more this system is activated. And that's pretty good evidence that this is an important system for reading, this system in the left side of the back of the brain. And this is a blow-up of that area from in another way of representing it. But what this area seems to be doing, it's called the word form area, is to integrate, is to just take all of these systems. And the better you are at reading, it grabs the phonology, it grabs the way the word looks, the orthography, it grabs what the word means and integrates it. And the better you are at reading, the better this system is connected. We've also learned how the system develops, and this is a study of about 100 dyslexic children compared to 100 typical readers. And typical readers are developing a system in the left side, outlined it in green, in the left side of the back of the brain, whereas dyslexic readers are developing a system I've outlined in red, somewhat in the middle of the brain and a little bit lower. And what was so interesting, because this has parallels to 2 writing systems that Japanese children learn. One is a system they learn first, which is similar to the way we learn English. It's called kana, and it's a sound-based system. And so the word sayonara, which is written this way, each of these characters represents a sound. So it's pretty much the same as you learn English. It's a sound-based system. But then a little later, Japanese students have to memorize these characters. And these are what is a system called kanji. And there are about 2,000 of these characters that the students have to memorize. And they use mnemonics. Here's from a Japanese textbook. The mnemonic for human shows a man. This is the character for man. And this is the character for a woman. It shows a woman holding up her skirt. It's hard to see, but so the students have to memorize about 2,000 of these. These characters were adopted from Chinese characters many 1,000 years ago, but they're all based in Japanese language now. And what's interesting is that any Japanese textbook or newspaper uses a combination of these sound-based and these memory-based systems. But for us, what was interesting is that these systems in Japanese writing system have parallels to the way the systems are developing in the typical readers. The system that parallels that is this sound-based system, kana, whereas the system that seems to parallel the memory-based kanji are those systems that are developing in our dyslexic readers. We've most recently begun, and I say we, many people who are doing brain imaging are saying, well, don't you think it's important to see how systems are connected? And yes, it is. And so this is a study one of our graduate students presented several weeks ago in a Society for Neuroscience meeting. And this is a really complicated figure. We tried to see, we took a group of about 70 children who are dyslexic compared to 70 typical readers at 9 years of age. And the blue are those dyslexic readers, and the red are the typical readers. And you can see there are differences, but boy, there's a lot of connectivity. And this is another way of representing the data. The typical readers are better connected in those regions in the left side of the brain and visual spatial areas, and also in an area in the front of the brain that has a lot to do with attention, whereas dyslexic readers seem to be better connected in the right side of the brain. These studies are sort of just beginning, and many scientists are trying to figure out what all this means. But it's sort of, I think, the next step in understanding dyslexia. How are these systems connected? But I think for the moment, what scientists around the world have concluded is that, yes, there is a neural signature for dyslexia. It's an inefficient functioning of those systems for skilled reading in the back of the brain. And the importance, I emphasize again, it's made a hidden disability visible. Dyslexia is real. Well, Sally's going to come back and really integrate what we've been talking about to try to tell you how we've translated scientific progress into practice.
Okay, I'm excited to be back here because Bennett and I, as you can see, are scientists, and we really enjoy doing the imaging and the epidemiology, but we're physician scientists, and that means we take care of real people. And you can't get to know dyslexic children and follow them as they get older and get to know their families without really caring passionately about, well, what happens? And so our mission in life, our passion, is to translate the scientific progress into practice. I want to first address the diagnosis of dyslexia. What has struck me so profoundly is that we know as much or more about the scientific basis of dyslexia, its neurobiology, its diagnosis, its management, than most other entities. At times when I've made rounds with our interns and residents and medical students, and we talk about heart disease or kidney disease, and we ask questions, I say to myself, wow, we know more about dyslexia. We really do. So it's important that we take that message and make it live so that people understand what it is. In my mind, it's inexcusable to miss the diagnosis. And it's important because that leads to effective evidence-based interventions. And I want to address an issue right now. Some people have told me, well, they don't want to label their child. Label. If it's just going to be a label that a child carries around and it has no meaning and no positive impact, you don't want to label. But if it's a diagnosis that brings understanding, self-awareness, empowerment, effective intervention, accommodation, and makes someone's life better, how could you deny a child or an adult that diagnosis? We have seen, and I know there's some wonderful, wonderful dyslexia educators here and tutors that can attest to what it means to a child's life, and individuals here. I'm so happy to see our young man here again, and David, you here, and see what being taught about dyslexia and about themselves have meant to their lives. And the diagnosis of dyslexia is based on science. Remember, it's not a belief system, it's a factual system. We talked earlier about how the children and adults we see in 2012 are no different than Percy, who was described by Dr. Morgan in 1896. We talked about how it's worldwide. We have seen people from the Far East, the Middle East, all over this country. It's a universal issue. And what's so exciting now is it's like a match has been struck and lit, and there's scientists all over doing research. And what we look for in science is, we're very skeptical. Well, if you see one result, you say, let's see, can they repeat it? And what's so nice, as Bennett showed you with the brain imaging, there's now replicated data, converging scientific data. That adds to the fact that it's real, it's valid. And what we now have to do is apply that scientific knowledge of dyslexia to taking care of real people. And that's what this meeting is all about. And I'm so happy to hear about Mississippi, about Baton Rouge, all over. It's happening. And we want to be part of it and make it happen even. Here's an example why it's important to put the parts together. Here's Olivia. And if we look only at the parts, you say to her, Olivia, what do you have? And she'll say to you, I have problems with auditory processing, processing speed, rapid naming, working memory, letter word IDs, pseudo-word decoding, and reading fluency. Oh, and I do better in comprehension, long-term retrieval, fluid intelligence, and visual spatial problems. Do you think that means anything to Olivia? No. It's just a bunch of jargon that's put in the jargon closet, not to be accessed. On the other hand, if you put it all together and look upon Olivia as a whole person, and you say, Olivia, what do you have? She'll answer, I'm dyslexic. And this is a quote from a real child that we actually saw and spoke to. Nothing about me has changed. Only now I understand what is happening. I'm empowered. It has a name, and I know others who are dyslexic. You're bringing a child knowledge, self-awareness, power, and connecting to a community. Children are so excited when they meet another child who's dyslexic. Oh, you mean I'm not the only one? So we have to give children that empowerment and that future.
The thing that was really difficult for me is that I didn't really realize what I had, so I would always think I was dumb, and it was just really tough.
She seemed very anxious, and then she would call me from the nurse's office, and she had stomach aches, and then I think that she just at one point said, my brain isn't working. I don't know what's going on.
What we've learned, and Sebastian as mother is going to say, children know there's something going on. And part of the definition of anxiety is the unknown. When you know something's wrong, but no one can say what it is, it becomes so scary. But if the veil is lifted, and you know it has a name, and what it is, and what you can do about it, and what your future can be, it's so different. Here's Sebastian expressing his relief.
And we received a diagnosis from, professional.
Like, I didn't know what dyslexia was, but then when I learned, what's it all about, it wasn't really that much of a surprise to me.
Sebastian's doing wonderfully. It's been so empowering for him to know that he was dyslexic and what it was and what he could do about it. And this is, I think, one of the most important slides I'm going to show you this morning. Because what it does is it looks at the whole person. And it's not just this, it's just that dyslexia is a whole entity. It's a diagnosis. And what it tells you is the origin of the difficulties, and that's getting to the sounds of spoken words. So when you know that, you know what the symptoms are. You know what to look for, you know how to recognize it, and how to put it all together. So if you have difficulty getting to the sounds of spoken words, what kind of difficulties will you have? Spoken language. And that can manifest itself early on as sometimes delayed speaking, mispronouncing things, not knowing, recognizing rhymes, because In order to know that cat, hat, mat, and sat rhyme, you have to be able to pull apart the word and just focus on the rhyme at the end. Word retrieval problems as people get older. If you have trouble getting to the sounds of spoken words, you're not going to pull them apart. So you're going to have trouble attaching the letters to the sounds. So you're going to have difficulty reading initially accurately, but then fluently, and I'll speak more about that in a minute. You're going to have difficulties not only in decoding, but encoding. When you hear the word, how do you translate like that into the letters? You have spelling problems. You often, I didn't have room on the slide, have problems forming the letters and writing, sometimes called dysgraphia. That's part of dyslexia. If you had trouble learning the sound system of your primary language, think of what it's going to be like if you have to learn a foreign language, a second language. That's not going to go well. We recently had a wonderful woman from Brazil who came to visit. She has a doctoral degree, and she told me that she struggled all through school, and then my book has been translated into Brazilian Portuguese, and she read it and realized she was dyslexic, and she started a whole school for dyslexic children in Brazil. And really intelligent, but you know who had to come with her? Her translator. As bright as she is, she says, I can't learn English. So her translator was with her. So here, I want to present to you and make dyslexia alive because it affects real living people. So you know what to look for, even before a child is expected to read. Problems in spoken language, delayed speech, not having verbal fluency, mispronouncing, not being glib, having word retrieval difficulties. You need time to summon a verbal response when questioned. And you struggle to retrieve words, and the feeling, oh my God, it's at the tip of my tongue, but it won't come out. And what happens over time, children, as they get older, they avoid saying words that they know they're going to mispronounce. So their spoken language vocabulary is smaller than their listening vocabulary, the words they understand. And I see people who obviously have experienced it or taught people who have that.
There are others who have dyslexias who have problems with pronouncing words and saying words in their correct sequence, etc., just like they do with reading. This can be very upsetting to them because they are often laughed at, or people make fun of people who do not speak fluidly or sometimes mispronounce words or use words incorrectly, and that can go with the dyslexia. That does not mean that they're not intelligent. It does not mean they don't know what they're talking about. It just means usually when they're in public, a combination of their dyslexia and anxiety and all the history of being humiliated comes to bear, and they don't present themselves in the best light.
And the most exciting for us as scientists is that we're beginning to understand the mechanism. And let me share that with you now. The mechanism of the word retrieval difficulties in dyslexia. So if you're a typical reader and you want to say the word bad, you think of it in your mind, and some may even visualize it, and then you translate that concept into the abstract semantic representation, bad. But then, in order to utter the word, you have to access and retrieve the individual sounds, the b, the a, and t. And that programs the articulatory mechanism, you know, the parts of your mouth and lips and tongue and palate that actually utter the word, and you say it. You don't think about it, it's so automatic and quick, aha. But if you're dyslexic, it's a totally different story. People who are dyslexic, they can come up with a concept. They know that, no problem, probably quicker than others maybe. They know they can activate the semantic, the abstract semantic representation, but then comes the ugly part. If you're dyslexic, you have to go into your internal lexicon, internal dictionary, and access and retrieve the sounds. Very hard. Either there'll be long pauses, imagine standing in front of a group, trying to say something and what comes out, or, as I said earlier, what will come out if you want to say cloisters, it may be oysters, or as we showed in the film, one of my favorites is a child who's dyslexic crossing a busy intersection, seeing people jaywalking, and the dyslexic little girl looking up to her father and saying, you know, Daddy, those Presbyterians should be more careful, and of course she meant pedestrians. And what happens, put yourself in this individual's place. You're intelligent, you know what you want to say, and yet what comes out of your mouth doesn't reflect that. So what we have is anxiety. And you have this horrible, reverberating cycle of not being able to get the word out, knowing it, and you get more and more anxious. So do you think it gets better or worse? It gets worse. So for example, if somebody's taking an oral exam, they need to be in a situation where people understand and are supportive and try to minimize the stress level. That's critical, that's essential. Here's a picture of Bennett and myself with Philip Schultz. Philip Schultz is a wonderful man. About a year and a half ago, I received a book asking if I would write the back material on it, a small book. So I read it, and I fell in love with it. And I was delighted to write the back matter. And what Philip has done is write a book called My Dyslexia. He won a Pulitzer Prize for poetry in 2008, and he's very dyslexic and a wonderful poet. There have been many dyslexic poets. And here's a quote: "There's one essential thing I now understand about my dyslexia, that writing a book about it also means writing one about my anxiety. Anxiety and dyslexia just go together." And it's been far too often underappreciated. And he also writes about his word retrieval difficulties, how he may, you know, poets write and then they get up and give presentations, and how on many occasions he's wanted to say something, knew what he wanted to say, but the word didn't come out, sometimes so badly that he'd have to leave the stage. And here again is our wonderful psychiatrist, Dr. Udovsky, talking about it.
The time pressure, the being in front of people makes them nervous. Anxiety and the dyslexia often form a vicious circle. So people with gifted potential go into a test feeling highly anxious that they won't finish. That anxiety makes their dyslexias worse. It makes them perform even worse.